Rory's a lecturer in quantitative human geography at UCL and has been researching housing, neighbourhoods and residential mobility. And particularly today, Rory's been focusing on young people and housing, and is going to present on problems concerning housing access and affordability for young people, and particularly obviously what the ONS-LS can tell us about that. And over to you, Rory.
Right, thank you very much, Fran. Yes, I'm going to be talking about housing and the longitudinal study. So what we're talking about today is obviously the stronger towns and the concept of stronger towns. So what I've done in the past is not particularly focusing in on stronger towns per se. So I'll show some results that I think are relevant to the discussion around stronger towns. But I'm also going to throw out a bunch of ideas and a bunch of kind of thoughts about how I think housing should be integrated into this concept of stronger towns. And potentially what we can do with ONS data, ONS longitudinal study data and census data more widely to kind of explore some of these questions. So it's a bit of a what can we learn from the longitudinal study, can be what do we already know, what have I already done on the topic, but can also thinking forward, where are we going to go with this particular research focus in the future. So I'll start off with a quote. So back in March, seems a very long time ago for many of us now, March 2019, the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister anyway, she's still the Prime Minister, Theresa May, announced the Stronger Towns Fund. And there were kind of two parts to the quotation that was provided a lot to go alongside this announcement at the time that I thought were particularly important for us in this room kind of today. So the top bit of the quote, where the Prime Minister says that for too long in this country, prosperity has been unfairly spread. So our economy's worked well for some places, but we want to make it work for every community. So here's inequality. Spatial inequalities are clearly the kind of the theme, the thing we should be thinking about when we're trying to design some kind of policy intervention to make towns stronger, or places stronger more generally, perhaps, as Tony's already sort of suggested. And the second part of the quotation, where part of this way we can gauge whether or not towns are strong and communities are strong, is do they give people opportunities? So do they give people opportunities to kind of improve their lives in some way? Because that's going to make social cohesion, improve social cohesion, and potentially have sort of political benefits as well. So it's those kind of two dimensions that I think are a really important starting point if we're going to think about housing and stronger communities. And that's what I'm going to talk mainly about today. So what am I going to do? I'll start off, I'll just give a bit of a background, sort of introduction to the topic, housing, place, and sort of inequality and social mobility, drawing in some of my own thinking and work on this I've done in the past. And as Fran said, I'm going to focus in particularly on kind of younger people and how housing kind of inequalities amongst younger cohorts of people. And there's a kind of pragmatic reason in that that's what I've done, so I probably should talk about that, but it's also, there's kind of a very policy relevant reason here, in that younger people and the sort of the plight of younger adults in the housing system is kind of the focus of many interventions and a lot of the rhetoric and discussion about housing at the moment. I'll show a few selected bits of evidence from the longitudinal study, my work on housing that's used that data set, and then reflect a little bit on public policy research agendas. So where do I think we should be going if we're going to build housing more strongly into this kind of concept, this idea of building stronger towns? How can we use housing as a lever to improve towns? And what do we need to think about when designing interventions to kind of make places stronger? And there's some really good links, I think, here to what Tony's kind of already talked about regarding migration behaviour and potentially the role of tenure and cost of living in where people are living and leaving. So these are kind of a lot of continuities here. So that's my focus. That's how I'm going to go. So we can start off. Well, why do we need to look at housing at all? Housing actually doesn't really feature very strongly in the Stronger Towns Fund announcement. If you look at it, it's mostly about jobs and education. So why should we be actually looking at housing as something that's kind of relevant? And I think there's kind of three key issues beyond the obvious kind of quality of life side of things, which is obviously a really important one for individuals. The first of these is simply that, as you'll be aware, housing is really important for your household budget. It's really important for the amount of income you have sort of left over at the end of the month. And we see this every year. There's a sort of a discussion about the release of the English Housing Survey statistics on kind of affordability of different kinds of tenures, which over the recent past have tended to show a pattern very similar to this. So what we've got here is a chart showing the proportion or the percentage of household income being devoted to housing costs, be that mortgage or rent payments, by households in different kinds of housing tenures across England, particularly. And in the recent past, buying with a mortgage, households with mortgages have been by far the household type that has devoted the lowest proportion of their income to housing costs, with the reverse being the case for private renters. So we've got big disparities in terms of who's paying what for different kinds of housing, different kinds of housing tenures, particularly. And we also know there's very much of a geography to all of this. So the National Housing Federation a few years ago did some work on the sort of the local affordability, trying to derive local affordability metrics for private rented sector. And this is the kind of the map they came up with at the time. So it's no surprises here that the parts of the country, southern part of the country around London, the Greater South East, but also the sort of around the Bristol Channel are the places where private rents are gauged as being the least affordable. And we can dispute and have a good debate about how we actually go about calculating affordability, which I'm not going to get into here. It was kind of a nice piece of work, because analysing the geography of renting and geography of private rents has been really difficult until very recently. We don't have very good local data on rents, and this is something that continues to be a problem. Well, I think ONS are aware of this and are doing some work on trying to get more sort of local geographies of rents data, which would be really useful. So that's one reason. The second reason that we need to start thinking about housing is that I think housing is playing a very important role in understanding the geography of mobility and how that's maybe changed over time. So the Resolution Foundation, about 2 months ago, released a report called Moving Matters, where they have analysed data. There's no one from the foundation in the room before I reveal that I haven't read it properly, or sort of attributing something you haven't actually said. Okay, so so that's good. So now I can make stuff up. No. So anyway, the essence of the report was that if you look at the graph on the left, we've got rates of address changing by younger adults across the UK going back in time. And the interesting thing here is that the foundation broke these down by tenure using data from the LFS, the Labour Force Survey. And you can see not much is going on in the bottom 3 or 4 colours there. Those are homeowners, social tenants, people living in the parental home. But there is a kind of interesting trend among the blue line, which is the private tenants. So there's a kind of a stark decline in private renter mobilities that the foundation observed, and they're looking here at mobility between local authorities. And they attribute this, in part, to changes in the geography of housing affordability and the affordability of renting. So the idea is that over time, rents have risen the fastest in the recent past in places where wages are high, and those rent rises have essentially eroded the advantage of moving to places with very buoyant labour markets. So this is the idea. So I mean, I've experienced this firsthand. You move to London, you get a pay rise, and there's nothing left at the end of the month that's extra. And the idea here is that that's a deterrent to actually moving in general and moving into those kinds of places in particular, which they didn't actually analyse because they didn't have the data of the right granularity, I think. So this is a really interesting starting point. I don't think this answers the question of what's going on with mobility and how's that changing over time, but there's clearly something worth analysing here, but perhaps also looking at local mobilities as well. Third reason, again, a financial reason, wealth. So recent years there's been a sort of resurgence of interest in wealth, sort of growing out of Thomas Piketty particularly, I think. And we know from the ONS Wealth and Assets Survey that a large proportion of household wealth in the UK is stored up in property, in private property. So 2016, I think the estimate was over 4.5 trillion stored in residential property, and particularly residential property, and that's roughly, I think, 60% of non-pension wealth, essentially, for households. So, wealth is really a really important thing we need to be thinking about, and housing, essentially, is really important as well. And there's a clear geography to housing wealth, where property wealth's much higher, median levels of property wealth much higher in parts of London, south east, and lower in sort of particularly the north west and north east, as well as Northern Ireland, I think. And this kind of, in recent years, this kind of trend has been sort of towards kind of divergence, with London sort of pulling away from the rest of the country, although, of course, there's no guarantee that's going to continue in the future. And recent signs, I think, of that potentially things are starting to change a little bit. So 3 reasons why I think housing needs to be part of a conversation about stronger towns, related to budgets, wealth, but also to mobility behaviours. So one of the things I'm kind of interested in doing in my work is kind of refocusing the housing debate a little bit away from the bricks and mortar discussion that dominates. That was exciting.
Hello.
Yeah, I'll carry on. That's fine. Thank you for that. Yeah, always exciting. Yeah, so I was trying to focus the debate a little bit away from just thinking about sort of construction numbers and the role of the planning system in sort of house building, and look a bit more at the social side of things. So, who's actually living in houses? What are their sort of experiences? What's their impact on quality of life? Because that's kind of really important. You know, the stock we already have in housing, you know, the vast bulk of housing is not housing that's been built in the recent past. It's very old, and housing stock takes a long time to change. So we need to be thinking about how we're using what we've got, as well as building more, essentially. And much of this conversation in recent years has been about intergenerational inequalities in housing. So thinking back to David Willetts and the pinch, you know, did the baby boomers steal their children's future by amassing all the housing wealth? And this conversation is really about the way that changes in housing and housing system have kind of had generational impacts, have impeded the social mobility, particularly prospects of the younger generation, and made these kinds of trade-offs between jobs and housing and where to live very, very tricky. So these are kind of some really interesting and I think important questions that we can actually apply the longitudinal study to try to understand. Because as we've seen, one of the things about the longitudinal study is it covers a very long time period. So we can study kind of cohort changes across long periods of time, and we can also look at how these relate to changes in what's going on in people's lives as well. So what is it that's driving cohort changes? Is it things that are changing in people's lives? Are people having partnerships later and that impacts on housing or economic behaviour? You know, these kinds of questions. We can start to tease these out. So what is the longitudinal study? This is the slide I had to put in because I had to get this presentation cleared by the Office for National Statistics, and they made me put this in. I tried to get it past them without having this slide in, but they wouldn't let me. So you've already heard about this, so I'm not going to say much about it, about how the study is designed. The most important things to note here are really that most of my work just uses data from the census questionnaires, not data from the linked life events, although those are really interesting and useful. And that the main advantages of the LS and the reasons that you might want to think about using it if you're interested in studying housing are that its sample size is really large. It's very useful, particularly if we're interested in certain groups like younger adults. Georeferenced, so we know about where people are living and we can attach on geographical information, which I'll showcase in a little bit. It samples individuals, and for younger adults this is really important because we can actually start to get a sense of who people are living with. And are people actually heading up households or not? So a lot of younger people might be living, as Tony said, might be living in owner-occupied dwellings, but they don't actually own the house. They're living with their parents, for example. And if we know about the relationships of people in the household to each other, we can start to unpack these kinds of issues. Fourth reason is simply the long duration of the study. So what I'll show on the next slide is just some cohort comparisons. So looking at changes in housing position of younger adults over 3 different cohorts. So here we go. Here's some graphs of the housing position of 3 cohorts of younger people who are 30 to 34. So comparing the housing situation of different kinds of different cohorts at the same age, essentially. So what we've got is we've got percentages on the y-axis here, and we've got 3 different cohorts. And these names are actually, in retrospect, not very good. It's always, interesting to go back to work you did a while ago and think that wasn't very good. But what we've got are the BBs, or the baby boomers. So those are people who were 30 to 34 in the 1990s, in the 1991 census. We've got what I call the post-boomers. It's a terrible name, but the basic point is that they are 30 to 34 in 2001, and Generation X, who were 30 to 34 in 2011. So we're looking at their housing situation in those different years. And we've got owner-occupation in the dark bar, social tenancies, private tenancies, and those people, and that's a really interesting group, who are not actually heading up a household. They're sharing, they're living with their parents. And we can see a number of things if we just from sort of visualizing these kind of patterns. We can see over time the proportion of the younger adults who own their homes gone down, no surprises there. But an equally important trend is the kind of reduction in social housing, particularly among women, younger women, which is an important thing to point out as well. We've also got the generation rent narrative coming through here of the growth of private renting, particularly for the group who were 30 to 34 in 2011. That's where we see the big growth of private renting in the early noughties. And particularly among younger men, we have quite a substantial proportion of younger men living in other kinds of household arrangements. So sharing, particularly a large chunk of sharers, but also living in the parental home. And we don't see those younger people and their circumstances when we look at data like the English Housing Survey, which is a household level survey, sampling households. We don't have very much information about the younger people living in those households with their parents and sort of what's going on there. So that's one way the LS can help us to kind of understand changes in housing circumstances, is because of this kind of relational dimension to the data. So that's one thing, sort of a starting point. Inter-cohort comparisons, really useful data set for studying that. But the LS can also help us to understand social mobility and kind of changes over time in individuals' life positions. One of the second thread, I suppose, of housing debate in recent years has been the extent to which housing welfare and housing access has become a family affair rather than something that's individual. So you open the newspaper and there's usually some kind of discussion about generation rent, the bank of mum and dad, often with an interview with a younger person sort of my age who's moved out to Hastings because they can't buy a house in London, or their parents, debates about the moral economy of giving and receiving money from your parents to buy houses. So it's a really kind of important and interesting topic. Got major implications as well for social mobility, so sort of ability of people to better themselves as they move through life, and also spatial inequality, because we can think that perhaps there's a spatial dimension to who's accessing family support and the bank of mum and dad in particular. We might think that people are more reliant on these kinds of transfers in places where housing is more costly. Perhaps there's greater inequality in home ownership access in those regions as compared with places where actually it's more affordable, if you want to use that word, to enter home ownership. And this was the whole point of Help to Buy, essentially, was to kind of overcome these issues. Although recently I think things are, the scheme is perhaps not helping those that are perhaps most in need, shall we say, if we want to put it like that. So this is something I wanted to analyse the LS. So how can we use the LS to understand changes in sort of social mobility and access to housing? So one way to do this is to take data on house prices or housing. You could use some other metric if you wanted on housing statistics at local levels, but I at the time was using house prices from the House Price Statistics of Small Areas database that ONS created, and attaching that geographical data onto the LS in 2011. So we can look at the cost of housing in local authorities in 2011, and we can model the probability of home ownership for younger adults at that time point, including, crucially, a variable for the parental socioeconomic status or housing tenure back when those young people were children. So in 1991, those young adults were 5 to 14, and they were most of them were living in the parental home. We can look at the parental circumstances at that point in time and link it to whether they've become a homeowner or not 20 years later. That's a really nice way of using this kind of data set. You need very long segments of longitudinal data to do that, and most of the surveys we have don't actually really go back that far. We have the British Household Panel Survey from 1991, but the sample size is quite small, and at local geographies that's going to be a problem for getting precise estimates of much of interest. 2011, cheapest local authority in terms of housing. I think this is the price of terraced housing. Burnley, most expensive, no surprises. Westminster, Kensington, Chelsea. The distribution is extremely skewed. It's extremely non-normal, so we probably shouldn't just plug that into a model. We're going to need to break it up into categories or log transform it or something like that, both of which I did as part of this piece of work. So that was the starting point. And then what we wanted to do was to look at the probability of home ownership, to model whether or not young people are homeowners in 2011, taking into account and controlling for those parental characteristics when they were younger. The hypothesis being that parents matter, kids whose parents were more socioeconomically advantaged are more likely to become homeowners later on, and that difference is bigger in places where housing is more expensive, essentially, to put it crudely. So what we have here is some of those estimates. So on the left we have the impact of parental socioeconomic status on young people's home ownership in 2011, and we're comparing children whose parents were managerial professional workers, essentially, which is the dark triangle, with those whose parents were routine, manual, sort of kinds of occupations. And again, we can vary those categories if we want, using the socioeconomic information on the LS. And what we see is that in districts where housing, the cheapest districts, cheapest 25% of house prices, there's actually not much difference by parental background in terms of probability of becoming a homeowner, but that kind of fans out as we move through the housing price distribution. As we move into areas where house prices are very high, housing is very expensive, there's a much greater sort of stratification of probability. And we get a similar kind of picture, but slightly more muted if we look at parental tenure on the right. So it's a really kind of an interesting way we can match on data to the LS and use it to study sort of the transmission or the continuities in socioeconomic position and housing across the life course, essentially. Why does any of this matter? Well, actually, if we then follow the kind of the property market trajectories of the different places of younger people at the time, we see those younger people who entered home ownership in around 2011 are going to the value of their kinds of housing is going to depend very heavily on where they bought their house at that time, and it's London and the southeast where the biggest appreciation of wealth has been over time. So, real implications, I think, for wealth inequalities, and also we need to think a little bit about the alternative kinds of housing. Though young people who are not homeowners, what kinds of housing are they living in? Well, many of them will be in the PRS and the private rented sector, which we know comes with a set of particular problems in the UK, particularly in England. All right, so to wrap up, some kind of conclusions and just reflections, I suppose. A couple of advantages of the LS, particularly the long time scale for cohort comparisons, and the geography, the fact we can link in geographical information, in this case on house prices. I think the results show that parental background is a more sort of significant factor for young people's home ownership propensity in more expensive parts of England and Wales, and that this potentially has implications for intergenerational transmissions of advantage and disadvantage over time. More generally, I think that should get us thinking about what role we think housing should play in a stronger town. What kind of housing market and housing system is a characteristic of a stronger town? Is it the case that we want a buoyant property market? So if we go back to the 2000s and the sort of the housing market renewal Pathfinder programs, part of the problem there was attributed in northern cities and Midlands to places having kind of poorly functioning housing markets which needed revitalisation. Is that still the case? Is that still what characterises a stronger town? Or is a stronger town, does it have some other kind of a property market? We need to be thinking about that. But there's very little discussion of that in what we know about the fund so far. In general, you're probably not surprised to know that I think housing needs to be an integral part of any policy making around this sort of issue, whether it's the Stronger Towns Fund or just place making more generally. As kind of Tony alluded to, there's a real opportunity here, I think, instead of to sort of focus on bringing jobs to people rather than trying to do things the other way around. So not necessarily treating the labour market as something that's sort of fixed and that should determine where we build houses and how we resolve the planning system, but maybe thinking about it the other way around. Can we actually go back to those old ideas of sort of the dirty word of regional development. Has that got a role to play in creating stronger towns? Possibly. And I think more importantly, there's a threat if we just ignore housing completely. And we've seen in some places that regeneration has impacts on the property markets and tenure patterns particularly that can erode people's prosperity gains. At the micro level, there's very clear issues of gentrification, displacement, and conflicts around those in some places that probably we should anticipate and think about. Is social housing a resource for stronger towns? Possibly. Certainly something worth thinking about. And a question that we need to be asking ourselves is, how does this all fit in a context of welfare reforms and particularly housing benefits? What's going on? How can we make a stronger town when at the same time we're capping benefits at quite a restrictive level? Future research ideas, which people are welcome to take up if they want. I think we need to be thinking about if we're thinking about young people, we need to be thinking about the geography of parents, where they live, how that affects young people's life course attainments. So there's a really nice quote from Theresa May back in 2018 about this, but as far as I know, there's very little known about the impact that where your parents live on your subsequent life chances, outside of sort of the health dimension, which is really important. And as been alluded to as well, one thing that's really important for us to take forward is going for some comparative work. So housing policy is devolved, and it's also diverging in many ways across particularly England and Scotland, but also Wales as well, to a lesser extent. So we should probably start thinking about harnessing the LS as well as the SLS to kind of look at the implications of this for people's life courses and housing attainments. So we've got very stark divergences in attitudes to right to buy and policy around whether or not right to buy is a good thing. In the private rental sector, landlord registration schemes in Scotland and also a few selected parts of England. Changes to the tax system around council taxation, but also stamp duty, different ways of doing things. What impact does this have on moving and on housing? So I'll wrap up there because I think I've gone a little bit over. Just quick thanks to the ONS for providing access to the data, and to the ESRC for funding this project, which was originally about young people and home ownership. Worth noting that this is just a couple of slides of results from that project. There's a lot more, and there's a sort of briefing paper series that distills it into a few series of pages summarising the research, which I can provide if you want to send me an email about it. So thank you.
Great, so we've got several questions there, and also possibly a microphone. Do we think, is it working? Oh, how wonderful. Great. I'm going to go over to the chap here because I think you were asking before. Don't forget to let us know who you are. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Paul Sweeney from the Centre for Cities. Looking at the evidence that you've presented, to me it supports the decision not to have housing mentioned in the Stronger Towns Fund.
Okay.
And that what it seems to be saying here is that actually because of the lack of new house building in particularly prosperous places, places that are already doing well, it's then not only sort of generating wealth for people who live there, but it's then pricing people out to be able to access the opportunity in those places. Yeah. So my diagnosis of this would be that building more houses in order to depress markets will do nothing to change the fortunes of those places. So just look at If you've taken that away from my talk, I've done something catastrophically wrong, which I might well have done. I think what I was thinking about was more about flipping it. So in a sense of a lot of the reason people want to live in these very tight housing markets is related to the labour market essentially, and that perhaps we might want to think about going back to focusing more on the jobs and opportunities in those areas, as a way of sort of relieving some of the pressure in other parts of the country. I would completely agree that house building's got a role to play, particularly in certain in places that are under great stress at the moment. And I wouldn't want to suggest that we build vast amounts of housing across places where there is not much work available. I think what we should be doing is twofold. We should be building more houses in parts of the country where people want to live at the moment for jobs, but at the same time we do need to be going back to those places that are doing less well and focusing very much on getting people to come back to those places
as Tony's been sort of suggesting earlier on. So it's in a sense about looking at the housing and labour markets together. And it was just a bit worrying looking at the Stronger Towns discussion that there was nothing about housing in it. I think that's a sort of a missed opportunity in many ways, and potentially, you know, a problem going forward, and particularly if we're thinking about welfare and non-market housing as well.
James Jennings, UCL Innovation Enterprise. So, just for point of clarification, Rory, in terms of the men and women lead households, to what extent are joint households put into that spectrum?
Okay.
So, from the 2011 aspect. And then just a general comment in terms of, I know you attributed housing to kind of like the labour market, but, you know, I've been involved in housing, and the main question of the matter is about housing need. And it's about, I did housing needs surveys in terms of attributed to need, not about relating to jobs and labour market. And a lot of the local authorities now don't do them anymore. So how can we get an accurate picture of need? And good to hit the point in terms of 2010, in terms of the welfare, because that's where a lot of the changes are exacerbated.
So two questions. So the first part of the question is regarding like housing and men and women and who owns what. And so it is treated as a joint. So you can look at it at the couple level, essentially. Whereas if either partner owns the house, you can attribute it as sort of an own thing. You don't have to do that decision, but that was what I did in that particular piece. Second part about needs. So I mean, I don't know really. I'm not sure how to respond essentially to that, except that I think it's a good idea. Essentially,
Yes, Ken Scores, UCL Institute of Education. I enjoyed both presentations and found them very stimulating. I certainly, from the research that we are doing in the market in Dagenham, and the relationship between the experience of working and learning in that borough, and in particular the driving effects of financial technology sectors, would support your idea of linking jobs and housing. In particular, I'm interested in this issue around everyday migration and the commute. Because that, if you look at the other work going on in UCL around supernova cities and commute patterns, you can see these are everyday migrants. And they're getting longer and they're getting more intense. So would that also raise the issue of the relationship within areas, for instance, between Manchester and Wigan, between Leeds and Bradford, between the centre of London as a monocentre, Barking and Dagenham, and out into Kent? Any analysis of what we call the commute supernova pattern would also support your idea of redistribution of jobs on a more polycentric basis, linked to transport systems, linked to new patterns of affordable housing. That's the kind of research we are doing. See the convergence of what you are doing.
I mean, it's not just. I mean, I've presented only a very small bit of my own research in that. There's a lot of work done by other people. I think there is a story around exactly what you say, around sort of a larger spatial scale. I mean, the Resolution Foundation have done some work on commuting and trends over time, and time spent on commuting and the way that's increased. And I think that's something that, we probably actually don't know enough about it in many ways. So maybe we should have a conversation about that later.
Let's make this the last one before lunch.